Hi, I'm Greg Roth from Penn State, the Department of Plant Science. I'm here with Elizabeth Dyck from OGRIN, and we're going to talk to you today about a project we've been working on for the last 3 years to evaluate alternative value-added small grains here in the Mid-Atlantic region. In particular, we're going to focus today on Spelt and Emmer, two crops you might not be that familiar with, but they're getting a growing following in the Northeast. And Elizabeth, can you share with me a little bit of your experiences and the market development for these crops?
Yeah, it's really exciting. Spelt has been is sort of been on the bubble with the public for a little bit longer. It's been grown for maybe 15, 20 years, but it's really coming on because the public is so interested in locally grown, healthy food, and also spelt. A lot of people that might have a little trouble digesting wheat have found that they can tolerate spelt. So for those three reasons, spelt has really been booming. And also emmer, another ancient grain, has been introduced starting out through sort of high-end restaurants and so forth. But now that the public is aware of how delicious emmer tastes and the fact that it can be locally grown, as you're going to talk about, emmer is really rising in popularity.
And we've had good success growing these new crops. Spelt is mostly grown as a winter crop in our area. It's grown basically like winter wheat, and we tend to use a little less nitrogen on spelt than wheat, but otherwise culture is pretty similar. And emmer is mostly a spring grain, although we'll talk about some winter varieties that are coming on. And it's grown in a fashion somewhat similar to oats in our region. And it tends to be fairly tolerant of stressful conditions. And it's also a covered grain like spelt is. And I was wondering, Elizabeth, if you could show us the difference between spelt and emmer and what a covered grain means.
So these ancient grains, they're called covered grain or hulled wheats, because this is what they look like when they come out of the combine. For the most part, they stay in their hulls, and it takes a separate process called dehulling, which can be somewhat involved, to get at what is the edible part of the grain. And here you can see this is spelt in the hull, and spelt that has been dehulled. And the interesting thing about this dehulled spelt is it can be eaten just like rice, or it can be milled and made into a huge variety of products. Over here we see emmer. So you can see it comes out of the combine, mostly still in its hull, and then again goes through the dehulling process, and you get this lovely grain, very distinctive flavor. Again, you can use it like rice, you can use it as pasta, you can use it for certain types of breads. So these have multiple purposes once they get to this dehulled state.
Tell us a little bit about the differences in the grain types here in terms of their hardness and use and dehulling between the spelt and the emmer.
Yeah, so spelt is relatively easy to dehull compared to emmer. And one of the reasons that we think it is that at least some of the varieties, and we're going to talk about one of them in particular, Maverick, are a lot easier to dehull. They're not held quite as tightly in their hull. And they also tend to be somewhat soft, so they're pretty easy to dehull, they're easy to mill. Now when you get over to emmer, particularly the spring types, and you're seeing spring emmer here, they're held very tightly in their hulls, so it's a little bit harder to dehull them. And the product is very vitreous, it's very hard.
Now it's somewhat unusual to be able to grow high protein vitreous grain in our region, so the emmer has some special characteristics in that regard.
That's right.
Now let's go out to the field and look at some of the spelt and emmer varieties that we have on trial here and talk about a few of their characteristics. Elizabeth, tell us about Maverick.
Yeah, Maverick is probably the most widely grown winter spelt variety in Pennsylvania, certainly, and it's very popular throughout the Northeast and the Midwest. The seed comes from French's hybrid seed. It's a very high yielding variety. In our trials, in all of our locations, it was consistently the highest yielding winter spelt variety. It's interesting for a number of reasons. Not only does it grow well, but it has good milling and baking quality. So it makes very good spelt products and spelt bread. And also, it has another interesting characteristic in that compared to other spelt varieties, all these spelt varieties and the Emmer variety we're going to see has to be dehulled. It has to go through another step after threshing because the hull adheres so tightly to the kernel, as we talked about earlier. And Maverick actually is the spelt variety that comes out a lot easier out of the hull than some of the other spelt varieties. So a lot of it will dehull in the combine. Earlier variety than the one next to it, and a little bit shorter. You want to talk about this one right now?
Yeah, then our next one is Oberkolmer.
Yeah, so Oberkolmer is a European variety. This is a true spelt. It's interesting that although spelt is considered an ancient grain, and we talk about modern wheats, wheat and spelt are actually the same species, which means that you can crossbreed them. They're subspecies of one another. But Oberkolmer is one variety of spelt that we know is pure spelt. It doesn't yield quite as much as Maverick. It's a little bit taller, a little bit more prone to lodging, but it also has excellent baking quality. So it has a lot of straw too. So farmers, especially organic farmers, like that as well. So it's another excellent variety. It always places number 2 in our winter spelt trials following Maverick. So here you see a number instead of a name. This is Accession. This is a spelt variety that we got from the National Germplasm Bank. And so it's just designated by a number, a unique number. And the reason that I wanted you folks to take a look at this is that unlike the name varieties we've been seeing, which are usually owned by a seed company, this is a variety that technically no one owns. And that can be very useful for some farmers who want to continually save their seed. Now, the reason we like this one is, although it doesn't yield quite as well as Maverick or Oberkolmer, it yields well. It has good winter survivability. The only perhaps downside is that it's fairly late maturing for a spelt. But I just wanted to point out that our project has been working with some of this public germplasm to see whether we can find new, in quotation marks, varieties that people can experiment with on their own, and there's no problem with saving seed and so forth. So this is what we're trying to do in each one of our categories of ancient wheats that we've been looking at, is to find germplasm like this. All I know about this is that this was collected in Baden-Württemberg, Germany, before World War II.
So another crop we're trialing is our Emmers. And their Emmers come in both spring and winter varieties. This one we're looking at right here happens to be a winter variety, planted last October. And here we see it in the field. This one's known as Black Emmer. Elizabeth, can you tell us a little bit about Black Emmer?
Yes, Black Emmer is kind of a generic term. There are several different varieties of Black Emmer. This particular variety comes from the Heritage Grain Conservancy, which has a website you can check. And it had a very interesting history with our project. One of our farmers bought a small amount of it, and he's done a fantastic job of bulking it, of increasing the seed. And this, in fact, is some seed that has been increased by him. And he's done such a good job now that instead of having to buy like a quarter pound of it or a pound of it and trying to increase it yourself, you can now actually get commercial lots of Black Emmer seed. The best thing to do is probably to get to the OGRIN website and give me an email or a call, and I can get you in touch with several farmers who are growing it. But we like it because we think it's going to be easier for folks to grow than spring Emmers. Less weed pressure, probably higher yield. We don't have enough data on that yet. And in terms of quality, we don't know much about its quality yet, although we did have one public tasting where we compared it to 3 spring Emmers. And as you might expect, just as there's a difference between spring and winter wheat, it looks like the same type of difference exists between winter and spring emmer, in that the folks that tasted this in comparison to the spring emmers liked it just as well, but they said it was less intense in its taste. So this is a magnificent crop, and we're hoping to learn more about it because I think we can grow it.
So management of the spelt and emmer crops is basically the same as winter wheat, harvesting on a timely basis, and then storing and monitoring for insects in the grain, and making sure you're monitoring the moisture of the crop. The test weights tend to be low of these covered grains because the husk material is included in the grain.
So another interesting thing about these ancient wheats is that where they might differ in some cases from the way you manage winter wheat is in the seeding rate. So for example, our colleague in North Dakota has had many, many years of trials, Steve Zwinger, on planting rate for spring emmer. And he has shown, and we've backed that up, you've backed that up with some of your work here, that you want to plant spring emmer at around 100 pounds per acre, which is somewhat lower than for winter wheat. Spelt, what do we know about spelt? It depends on whether it's planted in or out of the hull. If it's planted in the hull, then as you would winter wheat, maybe around 150 pounds an acre, correct me if I'm wrong, but if it's planted out of the hull, then around 120. That's what our good friend, spelt grower extraordinaire, Joel Steigman, tells us anyway.
That's right. Another thing we've noticed a little bit in working with some of the spelt growers, and this, at least anecdotally, it seems that tend not to have quite the vomitoxin problems that we can have with winter wheat. And I'm not sure whether it's related to the husk coverage of the kernel or resistance to the germplasm, but get a lot less issues. And I've even had that experience in my trial here one year where we had significant vomitoxin in some of our wheat, but low levels in the spelt. So that is also potentially a thing to be looking at as an advantage of these covered grains. It'll be interesting to look at that in emmer as well in the future. Elizabeth, can you tell us a little bit about seed availability for the spelt and the emmer lines we're talking about today?
Yeah, so the commercial spelt lines we've been discussing can be found. They're made available by French's Hybrid Seeds. And so they have a nice website, so I encourage you to get on their website and take a look at their entire line of offerings. The emmer is a little bit more difficult. Spring emmer is available, at least one variety in the Northeast. The best way to go about getting some seed is to contact OGRIN, contact me, and I can get you in touch with a grower.
And the winter emmer?
The winter emmer as well. The winter, and we're very excited about that. The particular winter emmer you just saw is available in commercial lots. And so if you get in touch with OGRIN, I can get you in touch with a grower.
Okay. Well, I want to thank Elizabeth for helping out with the video and also on our project for the last few years. I'd also like to thank you folks for tuning in on the video. And if you do have any questions on the production of alternative grains like emmer and spelt, please feel free to contact one of us, and we'd be more than happy to work with you on seed availability management or any other topics.